This week we are all about chemistry of life and molecules and all of those molecules that make up living organisms, how they're built, what they do. But why do we care about chemistry? Why are we talking about chemistry for a biology class, right? So all of life, everything that makes life possible, is basically just chemical reactions. And so if we have a sense of how those chemical reactions happen, the molecules that are involved with them, the atoms and the elements that are involved with them, we can get a better understanding of how life functions, okay? Especially as we're talking on the cellular molecular level, like we're going to be doing when we look at the DNA molecule later this term, right? Or if we talk about how cells function, like last week, right? All that is just chemistry. So here we're going to dive in and talk about an introduction to chemistry, enough so that we can understand how the molecules of life function. The chemistry of life is distinctive from other forms of chemistry in the sense that we see a common set of molecules in living organisms that we don't find outside of living organisms, okay? And most organic molecules, most molecules that are common to living organisms are based off of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, right? And we can combine those elements into many different types of biomolecules. So biomolecule just being any molecule that is unique to living cells and to living organisms that we don't find outside of life. And so life is based on carbon, right? So carbon is the most common element that makes up the molecules of living organisms. And all of the reactions that happen in a living organism are typically happening in the presence of water or in an aqueous environment, right? So I kind of like to think of cells like a bag of water with chemical reactions happening inside of them, with all these biomolecules zooming around and chemical reactions happening. Okay, so we get an understanding of how those biomolecules are built, the different types of biomolecules, how they're built, their characteristics, and how water functions. That helps us to understand how cells function and what's going on in a cellular molecular level. Okay, but what's all this stuff made out of? What is all this stuff made out of? So we are made out of, even though our chemistry is unique as living organisms, we're made out of the same stuff that everything else in the universe is made out of. And we call that stuff matter. So matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. Okay, so mass being the total amount of stuff that's in something, right? So mass is unique from weight. Weight changes depending on the gravity of the planet or the moon that you're standing on, but mass is going to be constant. It's the amount of matter that's in something. Okay, so that's the difference between mass and weight. But if something has mass, it will have weight. And there's different types of matter. Okay, so we say that each unique type of matter is composed of one of the different 92 different types of elements that we find in our universe, right? At least in our known universe that occur naturally. All right, so elements, the simplest form of matter, okay, and have the characteristics. Each element has a unique characteristics based on its components. So if we look at, these are the 92 naturally occurring elements. This is our periodic table right here, right? And so if we look at the elements that are common to living organisms, these are the ones that are found in red, in those red boxes, okay? And what we mean when we say an element is just a pure substance that has a very distinct and unique chemical and physical properties, okay? And we can't break it down to any other substance, okay? We cannot take an atom of oxygen and break it down to any other sort of atom, okay? So we typically find most of the elements kind of in this range right here are going to be very common living organisms, and some of these ones right here. Okay, so most 95% of the elements that make up living organisms are going to be carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. Okay, those four, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, make up 95% of all of the molecules in our cells. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up most of what's in our living cells, right? We also have all these other elements here, so we get to a total of about 12 elements that are very common in living organisms. And that's a slightly different ratio. This ratio of elements that we find in living organisms is slightly different than in the non-living portion of our planet, right? So carbon, there's a lot of carbon in living organisms, but if we were to take a look at like these rocks around here maybe, there would not be very much carbon in them at all, right? I don't see any carbon in here, right? We see a lot more silicon, okay, which is related to carbon, but So there's a different component or different proportions of elements in living organisms than non-living organisms, than the non-living matter. And one of the main differences here is carbon. Okay, so carbon, most of our molecules are based on carbon as their backbone, as their main component. Carbon bonded oxygen and hydrogen, and maybe some of these other elements in there too. So carbon, 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 carbon's the most important element for living organisms.